This man was trying to escape from something when he suddenly tripped and fell. But as he looked up, he realized he was surrounded by towering stone walls that were hundreds of meters high. Then, someone threw him into a pit and locked him inside. After a while, once the young man had calmed down a bit, the leader there took him around to get familiar with the environment. Although the place wasn't very large, everyone had their tasks and worked together to help each other complete them. It appeared peaceful, but the leader, Albie, told Thomas that this place was full of men, and the underground elevator would bring supplies and new arrivals once a month. The person who arrived that month was Thomas. Hearing this, Thomas suddenly remembered that when he had first woken up, he had found himself inside a secret elevator. He was confused, not knowing where he was. After a while, when the elevator doors opened, a group of men gathered around him. Thomas felt incredibly anxious and frightened as he realized he had been brought to such a strange place. At that moment, Albie explained that everyone here was like Thomas. They had no memories other than their own names and had no idea why they had been brought to this place. Finally, Albie warned Thomas never to go near the maze wall. Inside, there was something terrifying that humans could never uncover. Hearing this, Thomas became very curious about what was inside the maze. To make matters worse, he accidentally saw someone running out of the maze. So Thomas, ignoring Albie's advice, decided to sneak into the maze. However, as a result, he was pushed to the ground by someone named Gally. Thomas felt dissatisfied, stood up, and argued with Gally. At that moment, the stone wall behind them suddenly began to move. The once spacious path quickly closed off. This left Thomas even more confused and bewildered. His new friend, Newt, told Thomas that the maze only opened during the day and it would close at night. Different changes would happen inside the maze as well. Therefore, only the runners were allowed into the maze. But even they had to return before nightfall because there were monsters inside. No one who got trapped in there could survive the night. In the end, Gally's push was actually to save Thomas. Thomas understood the danger of the maze, but at the same time he guessed that the only way out was through the maze. This meant he wouldn't be able to leave this cursed place for a while. Newt advised him not to be too pessimistic, saying that runners had been marking the maze for 3 years. Maybe one day they could escape, but it was hard for Thomas to feel that optimistic. The next day, he discussed with Newt about ways to escape while working on the farm. They could climb the maze walls using the vines, or even hide in the elevator. But Newt said they had already tried these methods before, so they shouldn't think about them anymore and should focus on something more practical. After saying that, Newt tossed a basket to Thomas, telling him to go into the forest and get some manure for the plants. Thomas went deep into the forest alone, preparing to collect some high-quality manure. However, he found several human skeletons. Then, suddenly, a strange-looking person appeared behind Thomas. This man was a member of the runners named Ben. As soon as Thomas approached to greet him, Ben lunged at him like a wild animal and knocked him down. Ben kept mumbling that he had seen everything, that it was all Thomas's fault. The more he spoke, the more out of control he became, wanting to kill Thomas. During this time, Thomas didn't have time to think too much. He only focused on escaping. It wasn't until he ran back to the camp that others came to his rescue. Albie, with his vast experience, immediately recognized that Ben was not normal. When they lifted Ben's shirt, they saw that he had actually been bitten by a monster from the maze. Once infected with the virus carried by the monster, a person would gradually lose their sanity, becoming a zombie that attacked everyone everywhere. To protect the others in the camp, they had to push Ben back into the maze, allowing him to face the challenge on his own. That night, Thomas had a strange dream. He was part of an experiment with a girl, surrounded by faceless scientists. There was also a woman repeatedly saying, "It's quite effective." When he woke up, Thomas happened to see Albie and Minho following Ben's footsteps into the maze. However, it suddenly started raining, and everyone looked anxiously at the entrance to the maze. As the night began to fall, no one had returned. Minho reappeared at dusk, dragging a wounded Albie, but they couldn't make it to the entrance in time before it closed. When darkness fully set in, the door shut, trapping everyone inside, and the other young men expressed their regret and sorrow. The loss of 2 leaders was announced. Immediately, Thomas ran into the maze to help. Minho was shocked, never expecting someone would dare to go in and face death with them. The sky quickly darkened, and a dangerous breeze began to approach. Minho suggested leaving Albie, who was unconscious, behind. The 2 of them could run away, and there might still be a small chance of survival. They couldn't act like this any longer. At that moment, Thomas suddenly came up with an idea. He and Minho would tie Albie up with vines and hang him suspended in midair. As they were close to the last minute, Minho suddenly let go and ran. It turned out that the river monster had appeared right in front of them. Seeing this, Thomas quickly hid in the vines, not daring to move. When the monster passed by, he tightened the knot to ensure Albie wouldn't fall. Only after making sure that Albie was safe did he continue to hide. But just a few steps later, Thomas stepped into a disgusting pile of slime. After that, the river monster fell from the sky. It was a creature resembling a spider, but this ugly monster had mechanical legs. It seemed to have been released by humans, based on a flexible body and the ability to handle situations skillfully. Thomas managed to escape the monster's pursuit without any danger. In the end, Thomas used the nearly closing exit to trap the monster. In this way, the 3 of them successfully survived the night in the maze. When the crowd saw them come out of the maze, they couldn't believe believe it. This was the first time anyone had survived a night in the maze and returned. However, Albie's condition was not good. He had been infected by the virus, and his mind was not clear. While everyone praised how amazing Thomas was, Gally became extremely angry because Thomas had indirectly killed the monster. This broke the peaceful coexistence between the monsters and humans. Gally said that Thomas should be punished, but the monster had attacked many of their runners, so how could this be called peaceful coexistence? Minnow thought Thomas was brave and intelligent, and Newt, as the deputy leader of the group, pointed Thomas as a runner. Others started to join in as well. While they were debating, the sound of the elevator came from outside, but clearly, Thomas had only been there for less than a month. Then something unique happened. This time, the elevator sent the only girl ever to arrive. She was holding a piece of paper that said she was the last one to be sent there. As everyone was wondering, the girl suddenly woke up, and as soon as she opened her mouth, she called Thomas's name. Everyone's eyes immediately turned to Thomas, but he couldn't remember anything, so he certainly didn't recognize the girl. In the end, Thomas led Minho and the others into the maze, because he thought that now was the best time to investigate it. They retraced their steps and found the corpse of the monster. They also retrieved a sensor device from its body, which emitted a sound. On it, there was a label that read, Disaster Logout Zone Earth Experiment, or simply, Experiment Zone. Coincidentally, a similar term had appeared in the elevator when supplies were brought in. Therefore, the people who brought them here were also the ones who created the monsters. Thomas believed that this sensor device could help them find a way out of the maze. But at this moment, Minho, who had always supported Thomas, took him to a place and showed him a handmade model of the maze. This was the result of 3 years of searching by the runners. However, even though they had run through every corner of the maze, they had not found an exit. Minho added that the maze was divided into 8 sections, and these sections were turned on and off in a sequence. Different sections opened every day. Thomas looked at the number 7 written on the sensor device. It could correspond to section 7 of the maze. They had a bold idea to explore section 7. Just then, 2 boys ran up to them and reported that the girl had woken up. The only girl saw many men at once. She was holding a weapon, standing on a high platform, and desperately defending herself. Since Thomas was the man she had called out to, he had the opportunity to step up to the platform and try to calm her down. Thomas briefly explained the situation to her. He reassured her that memory loss was a common thing, so there was no need to be afraid. Eventually, the girl calmed down and told Thomas that her name was Teresa. However, Teresa still didn't understand. Since she had fainted, she had been trapped in a cycle of dreams. Listening to her, Thomas realized that it was the same dream he had experienced. He suddenly realized that the girl who appeared in his dream earlier was Teresa. This made him realize that it wasn't a dream, but rather a memory that had actually happened in reality. Teresa then took out 2 syringes filled with an unknown liquid. Seeing the familiar label, Experiment Zone, on them, Thomas was overjoyed. He thought of Albie, who was badly injured and wouldn't survive much longer. So he took one of the syringes and injected it into Albie, and indeed, it worked. After the injection, Albie stopped screaming and lost his delirium. The next day, Minho and Thomas went into the maze again. With the help of the sensor device, the 2 of them successfully ventured into the treacherous depths. They discovered a circle where they found traces of the river monster's slime. Suddenly, a red laser beam swept across them. The maze system seemed to detect that they were not monsters and immediately closed off the exit. At the same time, several traps were activated, aiming to clamp them down. Fortunately, the 2 of them ran fast enough and narrowly escaped with their lives. The 2 of them both believed that the circular passage was the way out. Since the monster could enter the maze through it, they thought that everyone could use it to escape as well. However, Gally disagreed with their plan, fearing that the monster's lair behind that exit would be more dangerous. Before they could analyze it further, Albie woke up. He had even regained his memory. Albie seemed to recognize Thomas from before. Sadly, he said that the ultimate goal of the experiment was Thomas. All the people trapped here were there because of him. Thomas was stunned by Albie's words. This wasn't the first time he had been blamed for something. The boy infected by the virus earlier had said something similar. Before they could resolve this, another problem arose. That night, the entrance to the maze didn't close when nightfall came. Strange noises echoed, and many river monsters began to approach from all directions. A bloody massacre officially began. Everyone panicked and ran in all directions. Albie was also captured by the monster. The attack wiped out more than half of the camp's population. Gally charged at Thomas, accusing him of being the cause of the disaster. The punch made Thomas realize that he needed to uncover the truth as soon as possible. Thomas decided to replicate the method Albie used to recover his memories. To induce a form of poisoning, he deliberately stabbed himself with a monster's venomous stinger, hoping to trigger the memories buried deep within him. However, instead of the desired effect, he found himself succumbing to the poison, his sanity slipping away. Fortunately, Teresa had one more syringe left. The group quickly used it to save Thomas's life. After waking up, he told everyone the truth about what he had seen after being poisoned. He revealed that both he and Teresa were internal agents of the WCKD testing facility. The other gladers had been subjects in the experiments conducted by the organization. For years, they had been observed and tested, but the specific reasons behind their presence in the maze remained elusive to Thomas. Meanwhile, Gally, the second in command, had taken control of the camp in Albie's absence. He had always opposed Thomas's reckless actions, advocating for strict adherence to the rules and the maintenance of the status quo to restore peace within the camp. Gally believed that sacrificing Thomas and Teresa to the monsters was the only way to ensure their safety, reasoning that such a sacrifice would prevent the monsters from appearing and instilling fear among the others. At this critical moment, Minho, Newt, and the rest of the group banded together to rescue Thomas and Teresa. They decided to join Thomas in searching for the way out of the maze. This was nothing short of a rebellion, and Gally had warned them not to cause trouble because the camp was their home. Entering the maze was seeking death. Thomas responded that it was better to take the risk of going outside than to sit and wait to die here. The camp was not a home, it was a prison. His words resonated with everyone. Among those on Gally's side, someone stepped forward and joined Thomas's escape plan. So Thomas led those who were ready to leave into the maze. After working together to defeat the first monster, more monsters appeared and charged forward. In the chaos, Thomas told Teresa to open the exit using the sensor device, but to their surprise, they still needed to enter an 8-digit password. Thomas suddenly realized that the maze had 8 sections. He quickly called Minho to tell him the sections' positions to input the numbers. But just as Minho began to speak the first 4 digits, he was pinned to the ground by a monster. In this critical moment, one member of the group stepped forward and used all their strength to save Minho. Thanks to this, Teresa was able to decode the password. The exit was successfully opened. The moment the exit opened, the large stone above the maze began to collapse. All the monsters chasing them were crushed to death on the spot. Although the immediate crisis had passed, the fierce battle had claimed many lives. The survivors continued to move forward. In front of them was a room full of bodies piled up in a heap. They had all been shot with gunfire. Thomas realized that this was the experiment he and Teresa had seen in their dream. Was this the base of the maze from the experiment? Thomas unlocked the control panel with his fingerprint. The head of the department, Ava, appeared on the screen. This was the footage she had recorded for the survivors after they lost their memories. The mystery behind the existence of the maze was explained. It turned out that the planet had been devastated by a massive solar flare. Countless people had been incinerated, leading to a widespread famine across the world. What was even worse was the outbreak of a deadly virus known as the Blaze virus, which primarily attacked the human brain. The only people who were not infected were a group of infants. These children were humanity's hope to fight against the virus. That's why the experimental agency kept these children immune to the virus in harsh environments to observe their brain activity, and through cutting off their connections to study the differences between them and normal people. They hoped to find a cure for the disease, but unfortunately, the progress of the experiment was extremely slow, and not everyone agreed with the brutal treatment of the test subjects. Ultimately, the dissenters launched an assault on the WCKD facility, resulting in the deaths of many staff members. As Ava recounted these events in the video, she chose to end her own life, leaving behind the chaos of her reality. Just as the truth was finally revealed, the last door began to open slowly. With the group poised to escape, Gally appeared, gun in hand, his demeanor suggesting he had been bitten by the river. In a feverish state, he demanded that everyone remain in the maze, aiming directly at Thomas with malicious intent. In that critical moment, Minho stepped forward, driving a spear into Gally's chest. Gally collapsed, leaving Thomas unharmed, while the group breathed a collective sigh of relief. However, their relief was short-lived when Jack, the youngest member of their group, suddenly fell to the ground. The boy had blocked a bullet meant for Thomas. Before he died, Jack handed a keepsake, an engraving of himself, to Thomas, and asked him to return it to his biological parents if he ever had the chance to meet them. Jack, having lost his memory, didn't know who his parents were, but his longing for connection was palpable. It was his way of expressing a desire for the world outside their confines. Thomas was overcome with grief, crying out in anguish. But before he could even process Jack's loss, a group of masked individuals burst in. They were the opposing faction Ava had mentioned in her video. They ruthlessly dragged everyone away and put them on a helicopter. Back at the base, Ava, who had seemingly ended her life with a gun, made an unexpected return. It turned out that her death was merely a ruse, part of an elaborate plan. She announced to the remaining members of the WCKD facility that the initial phase of the experiments had exceeded their expectations, with more survivors than anticipated. Thomas's performance made them incredibly pleased, and the second phase was about to begin. Ava believed the results would not disappoint them. The helicopter flew over the ruined city. A maze, built in a desolate desert land, was finally revealed. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief after successfully escaping danger, but what awaited them ahead was a new experiment. After the disaster broke out and the world plunged into darkness, a mother crossed the crowd alone and handed Thomas into the arms of the experiment team. She hoped her son would be protected and allowed to live. Thomas looked around the dark carriage and saw that there were many other children like him. With Eva's appearance and the overwhelming fear, he startled away. Then Thomas fell back into the panic of reality. The whole team was attacked, and Thomas and his group were dragged away by the guards, with the helicopter providing support. The survivors were escorted to a safe shelter, and the person in charge was named Jansen. He explained to Thomas and everyone that they had always rescued young people people harmed by the experiment, offering them a safe place to stay and protecting them from the threat of the virus related to the zombies. In the shelter, there was nothing to worry about. After the staff finished checking the basics, everyone would be assigned to a safer place. It turned out that there was more than one maze in motion. Looking around, it was clear that everyone there was lucky to have escaped the maze, but most of them had only been there for a day or two. The strange guy, Eris, in the corner, was also one of the lucky ones who had escaped the maze and arrived at the facility, and his maze was full of girls, except for him. At that moment, it was time for dinner, and the daily selection person event began. Anyone whose name was called was happy because they were about to be sent to Scott to start a new life. Anyone who was not chosen would feel discouraged, but Eris was the opposite of the others. He seemed to be scared when he heard his own name. At that moment, Thomas noticed that Teresa was being taken somewhere alone. He quickly ran to ask the reason. The person explained that she was just going to do some tests. Thomas was very worried, but he couldn't say anything else. At night, Eris crawled into Thomas's room through the ventilation shaft. He took Thomas into a restricted area. The two of them saw a doctor pushing a man into a medical experimentation chamber, which didn't seem like a big deal. But what was strange was that Eris observed the man being pushed inside for a long time, and he still hadn't come out. What exactly were these people doing? Thomas needed to uncover the truth. On the second day's meal, Thomas tried to follow the person who was called by name out, but unfortunately, he was caught by the guards. What was unusual this time was that Thomas didn't tolerate it anymore. He even fought back against the guards. In the end, everyone in the dormitory was put under lockdown. Back in the dorm, Thomas took the pass card he had stolen from the guard. He explained to everyone about the oddities of the shelter and instructed everyone to fully support him. Afterward, Thomas followed Eris and crawled into the ventilation shaft again. This time, the two of them successfully entered the medical experimentation chamber. To their surprise, the first thing Thomas saw was a monster embryo in the maze. As they went deeper, they discovered that the people who had died at Scott were all here. Everyone was suspended, with blood flowing out and tubes inserted all over their bodies, seemingly extracting something from their blood. Just as the two of them were stunned and shocked, Jansen unexpectedly brought someone into the experiment chamber. Thomas and Eris quickly hid behind a column, and thus they accidentally overheard a bigger secret. It turned out that Ava hadn't died. She ordered Jansen to speed up the experiment. This was because the Ryam, a resistance group in the mountains, had destroyed 2 bases. Thomas realized that something was wrong, so he quickly ran back to the dormitory. After explaining what Jansen and the experiment were plotting, he urged everyone to escape quickly. By the time Jansen arrived, they had already climbed out through the ventilation shaft, and they also took a female doctor hostage along the way. However, the guards showed no mercy when they saw them. Gunshots immediately rang out, but they were not allowed to endanger anyone's life. This was because Jansen had ordered them to capture, not kill. Fortunately, a strong man knocked out one of the guards and conveniently took his gun. After they found Teresa, they set off together to escape, with Jansen leading his team in pursuit. Fortunately, due to the door being locked tight, the soldiers managed to catch up with Thomas and the others. Jansen advised Thomas not to rush leaving the base, as they would certainly be killed under Crank's hands. Crank were people who had been turned into zombies by the flare virus, but Thomas, being naturally straightforward, didn't believe it. He pulled the trigger and fired the gun, then turned and ran. Eris was also very clever and immediately broke the door lock, temporarily blocking Jansen and allowing his group to continue their pursuit. The group eventually reached the real outside world. It was a world that had been submerged in sand and was nearly a wasteland. To avoid being captured, they hid in an abandoned market. The next step was to find Ava and Jansen to talk. At this point, they mentioned the Ryam. If the Ryam attacked the experiment facility, they should choose to side with them. But first, they needed to gather some supplies from here. In the darkness, everyone fumbled with flashlights. After a while, they found a light switch, but the light woke up a Crank that had been sleeping. One of the group members was unfortunately scratched by a Crank while trying to escape. The others hid in the rubble. The next day, everyone started walking through the desolate city. Ahead of them was an endless sea of golden sand. The harsh environment caused one of their teammates to faint. They had no choice but to carry him on a stretcher and continue. During a break, Teresa told Thomas that she had regained her full memory. She convinced Thomas to take everyone back to the experiment facility because the truth was far more complicated than what Thomas had seen. Just as Thomas was about to ask more questions, Winston, his teammate, suddenly reacted. To avoid involving others, Winston asked Thomas to shoot him, but no one could bring themselves to do it. In the end, Newt had to hand the gun to Winston. The young people had originally thought they were completely immune to the virus, but through this experience, they realized that they too were at risk of being infected. It seemed that not everyone was immune to the virus. The group continued their adventure through the desert. One night, Thomas woke up and discovered a civilization in the distance. At that moment, a storm hit, and Minho was struck by lightning, but fortunately, he was still okay. They hid in an abandoned factory in panic. Just as they thought they were safe, Cranks who were chained up in the abandoned factory attacked them. Before they could fully grasp the situation, a girl from the Crank group stepped forward and led them inside the factory. It turned out that this was a temporary base space for the survivors who lived in groups. The leader was a man named Horge. The girl, Brenda, who led them inside, was Horge's adopted daughter. Horge was also a man of power. Upon meeting them, he immediately asked Thomas and his group where they came from and where they had been. Thomas replied that they were from WCKD and were looking for the Ryam group. When he learned that they were from the experiment facility, Horge was very pleased. He had heard that the Ryam had always accepted immune children from WCKD, so Horge planned to use Thomas's group as a stepping stone to gain access to the safe base established by the Ryam. After that, he wouldn't have to hide here and worry anymore. Unexpectedly, one of Horge's subordinates betrayed him for money. He secretly informed the experiment facility. Soon after, Jansen arrived with a large army. In the chaos, Brenda arrived just in time to take down the traitor. She saved Thomas and his group, but as they tried to escape, Thomas and Brenda were blocked by the experiment facility's gunfire. At a crucial moment, a bomb that Horge had purchased a long time ago exploded, causing significant damage to the experiment facility's forces. The base building also started to collapse, and the two of them, trapped, could only find an escape route through the sewer. There was nothing but sewer rats. Most of them were cranks who had not seen the sun for a long time. The cranks there looked like starving ghosts, eager to tear humans apart. The two unlucky individuals found themselves in the heart of the cranks' den at the same time, and were chased until they were cornered. With no other way out, they climbed up the rubble. In the panic, Brenda slipped and hit her head on a glass panel. Once the glass shattered and fell, she would surely die. Thomas cautiously approached and tried to save Brenda. Just then, a crank that had been chasing them attacked and knocked her down. In that desperate moment, Thomas killed the crank with the glass and saved Brenda. Although they managed to escape, Brenda had been bitten by a crank. After a quick bandage, the two of them went to a bar that had been arranged beforehand to meet Horge. To be allowed into the bar, they had to play by the owner's rules. First, they had to take a sip of the delicious green liquor. Immediately after, Thomas began to hallucinate to the sounds of the hypnotic music, and he mistook Brenda for Teresa and kissed her. He then passed out again. In his unconscious state, Thomas vaguely remembered being with Teresa in the experiment facility earlier. He tried to warn Teresa not to trust anything that anyone in the experiment facility said, because they were all part of the experiment's plan. But before he could finish, Jansen appeared and dragged him away. Thomas suddenly woke up. Coincidentally, the first person he saw when he opened his eyes was Teresa. The other lost members were also present. At that moment, Horge was delivering a lesson to the bar owner with his fists. Initially, Horge believed the owner was a key figure who could help them locate the Ryam. However, after the recent events, Thomas realized the owner was nothing but a fraud. While pretending to support the Ryam's mission to rescue the immune, he had secretly spiked the drinks of immune youths like Thomas with ecstasy, later selling the information to WCKD. Fueled by anger, Horge landed another brutal kick on the owner. Cornered, the bar owner reluctantly revealed the location of the Ryam. Following this lead, the group set off again, but they were ambushed on the way. Two young women, Harriet and Sonia, launched a surprise attack on the crowd. Just as tensions were about to escalate into a fight, Ares called out to the girls, greeting them warmly. As it turned out, Harriet and Sonia were old acquaintances of Ares from the maze. They also knew the whereabouts of the Ryam's stronghold. With the help of the two women, the group finally reached Vin, the leader of the Ryam. However, just as they arrived, Brenda collapsed, having been infected. Vin, with his experience, quickly recognized the wound as one inflicted by a crank and prepared to execute Brenda to spare her further suffering. But Mary, a doctor from the base, stepped in to intervene. She had drawn a small sample of blood from Thomas, explaining that it could be used to create a temporary antidote to alleviate Brenda's condition. It turned out that Mary had once been a scientist at WCKD, so she recognized Thomas immediately and revealed that Thomas had actually been their spy before. He had hidden within the experiment facility to provide them with a lot of intelligence. Mary remembered the time in the experiment facility. Back then, they had dedicated themselves to the research, hoping to find a cure to save the world. A generation of immune youths was the key to solving the problem. They realized that the brains of these immune individuals produced a type of enzyme. If these enzymes could be extracted from the blood, they could create a powerful drug to slow the spread of the virus. However, because it only slowed the virus's spread, infected individuals would occasionally need to receive another injection. But these enzymes couldn't be synthesized. They could only be collected from the body of an immune person. Therefore, the immune youths were the raw material for creating the drug. The Ryam believed that young people also had the right to live, so they stood up to fight against the experiment facility. After hearing Mary's explanation, Thomas, who had lost his memory, finally pieced together the details of what had happened. What was astonishing was that after Brenda was injected with Thomas's blood, her condition improved significantly. Just as everyone thought things were progressing in a better direction, Teresa stood alone on a high spot, gazing out as if she wasn't happy at all. Thomas approached to comfort her. Teresa was calmer and told him about her past memories. Before coming to the experiment facility, Teresa's mother had been tortured to death by the virus, so finding the antidote had become Teresa's lifelong dream. At that moment, she had informed the facility of her location. From Teresa's perspective, the experiment's motives were good, but if the Ryam hid all all the immune individuals, how would the development of the cure progress? Immune individuals had the right to live, but didn't those who were infected deserve to be saved too? Because of Teresa's betrayal, the Ryam's base was attacked relentlessly by the experiment facility, and all the immune individuals were captured. Thomas had actually had a chance to escape, but in order to save others, he had voluntarily turned back. Ava had arrived at the scene by helicopter and was personally overseeing the situation. She advised Thomas not to cause any more trouble, because in her view, the Ryam wasn't as righteous as its name suggested. The laboratory was only because they wanted to find the antidote. Although the process was cruel, it was truly the most effective. On the other hand, what has the Ryam done? They just waved the so-called banner of righteous freedom and caused more trouble. At that moment, Mary stood up to expose all the crimes of the experiment, but little did she know that Jansen, fearing exposure, pulled out a gun and shot Mary dead. Thomas, in fury, took the bombs from his body to show his determination never to return. Just as the situation between both sides was tense, Horde drove up to interrupt. Many young people were captured, but taking advantage of the chaos, some managed to escape. The Ryam then launched a fierce counterattack, leading to a bloody battle with heavy casualties. The WCKD forces captured the surviving immune people, including Minho, Eris, and Sonia, but everyone could only helplessly watch as the door slowly closed. The next early morning, Vin led everyone to clean up the battlefield. In the end, he told everyone that he would take the survivors to safety, but Thomas had no intention of leaving with them. He had made up his mind to rescue his comrade Minho, even if he had to do it alone, and to stop Ava from continuing this brutal experiment. His teammates were moved by Thomas's courage, so they all joined his group. This time, they would launch a final counterattack against WCKD. To rescue Minho, Thomas and his group devised a plan that took 6 months. They found the train of the experiment group escorting the immune people, and they had planned a major train robbery. Jorge and Brenda attacked from the side to draw fire. Thomas and Vin would attack from behind and detonate the bomb at the train junction. They successfully hijacked the last 5 carriages of the train. Meanwhile, Jorge and Brenda also successfully lured the enemy, tricking them onto a plane that had been rigged with a trap. After the hijacking, they took the targeted carriages away. However, among the dozens of immune people they saved, Minho, the one they wanted to rescue, was not among them. The experiment group knew how important Minho was to Thomas, so they had moved him elsewhere. Fortunately, the rescued immune people provided a new clue. The destination of the experiment group's train was a city, but upon further thought, the whole world was now a wreck. The only place that could be called a city was the headquarters of the experiment group. Thomas immediately devised a new rescue plan. If everything went well, they would return in a week, but Vin disagreed. He believed the top priority was to get the rescued people to the base on the island. They couldn't put everyone in danger just for Minho. Furthermore, they had already hijacked a WCKD carriage, and staying there waiting to be attacked was not an option. Just as he finished speaking, the experiment group's plane appeared near the camp. Luckily, they had turned off the switch and the lights quickly enough, so their exact location wasn't exposed. This made Thomas realize that Vin's words had some truth to them. However, his comrade Minho was in trouble, and he couldn't just sit idly by. He decided to go rescue Minho alone, but his teammates wouldn't allow him to play the hero by himself. Newt and the others had already prepared a vehicle and were waiting to set off together, but this group of young people was clearly not skilled at driving, and in an abandoned tunnel, they unfortunately overturned the vehicle after being relentlessly attacked by cranks. At a critical moment, Brenda and Jorge arrived just in time to rescue everyone. Soon after, they all reached the city they had been aiming for to stop the crank attacks. The experiment group had built a strong wall around this only city. No one could easily enter unless allowed. The wall was equipped with heavy weapons. A large number of refugees protested and demonstrated outside the city, as living in fear of crank attacks was extremely difficult for them. They all wanted to get into the city and find a place to stay. Thomas's group could only circle outside, waiting for an opportunity. However, the experiment group's drone soon detected the chip on Thomas' neck. After Jansen discovered their location, he ordered an explosion that devastated the area. The city was in turmoil, with infection rates skyrocketing daily. Ava, now the head of WCKD responsible for developing the antidote, revealed that they had extracted the strongest virus antibodies from Minho's body. However, creating an effective antidote would take considerable time. However, the investors had proposed pulling their funding at this critical moment. Instead of investing money to develop an antidote, they thought it would be better to build more safe zones, like the last city, to protect the healthy people. Teresa, unable to contain her frustration, pointed out that the number of infected individuals had tripled compared to the healthy. Constructing safe zones would merely postpone the inevitable for ordinary people. Essentially, they were fighting a losing battle against the virus. If they halted the project now, all previous sacrifices would be in vain. Thanks to Teresa's relentless efforts, the chaos temporarily subsided, but time was running out. Meanwhile, Thomas and the others, despite narrowly escaping the artillery fire from the facility, found themselves captured by a group of masked rebels. To their shock, the leader of this insurgent group was none other than Gally. After he had killed Jack, Minho had stabbed Gally in the chest with a spear, leaving him for dead. How he had survived was a mystery, but there was no time to ponder that now. When Thomas recalled Jack's tragic death. Rage consumed him. He charged at Gally, throwing a punch fueled by grief and anger. Newt quickly intervened, separating the two and reminding Thomas that Gally had been bitten by a crank, which had driven him to madness and mistakes. But Thomas was still puzzled. How had Gally ended up here, among the insurgents? Gally, once a member of their original camp, seemed to have shifted allegiances, but he assured Thomas that he didn't intend to tie them up or harm them. Instead, he wanted to collaborate with Thomas's group. With a moment of clarity, Gally revealed that he knew a secret entrance to the city, a potential way for them to escape the chaos outside. Once tensions eased, Gally led them to meet the leader of the rebels. Lauren, who had saved Gally's life during a previous encounter, bore the marks of prolonged infection. The virus had not only caused him to lose his nose, but had also grotesquely altered the right side of his body, resulting in calloused skin resembling the bark of an ancient tree. To keep the virus's progression at bay, Lauren was required to have a supply of immune serum on hand at all times. Inspired by the situation, Thomas devised a plan. He would negotiate for the serum that Lauren needed most urgently. Lauren didn't deny it and immediately agreed to help Thomas enter the last city through the secret entrance. After reaching an agreement, Gally led Thomas's group through the sewer system. The prosperity of the city remained the same as before the virus outbreak, with tall buildings glowing brightly. However, the streets were empty whenever it was curfew time. Because of the appearance of Thomas and the others, Jansen became even more cautious. The headquarters of the laboratory was packed with security. Each floor had scanners installed, and there were cameras everywhere. It was like an impenetrable castle. After surveying Gally, the only way was to take Teresa. Some people objected because Teresa had betrayed them before, and of course, Thomas didn't want to either. He couldn't forgive Teresa for her betrayal, but he still cared for her. At that moment, Teresa had suffered the greatest blow. The strongest serum she had created from Minho's blood still failed when she injected it into the infected girl. The worst part was that Ava realized the virus had begun to spread in the air. In a month at most, everyone in the city would be infected. Johnson felt there was no need to be pessimistic. By then, they could just move the immune people to another base. Ava countered, asking what would happen if they ran out of immune people and still hadn't developed any cure. Perhaps what should be discarded would be discarded sooner or later. Instead of torturing these young people, it was better to accept the natural order and leave hope for the next generation with immunity. The situation was becoming more urgent, and Newt had also been infected in an inexplicable way. Thomas had to push aside his thoughts about Teresa, as he needed to save his teammates. He had no choice but to use Teresa to infiltrate WCKD. Thomas took the lead in revealing himself to lure Teresa to a place with no one around, then kidnapped and took her away. The plan was to use Teresa as a hostage to help them sneak into the experiment group's building and rescue Minho. Teresa struggled internally. On one hand, she felt she was fighting for justice. No matter how many people had to sacrifice for the development of the antidote, it was worth it. But at the same time, as a researcher, Minho no longer had any value to exploit, as his serum couldn't save anyone. In the end, Teresa decided to help them, so they wouldn't be detected by the experiment group's surveillance devices. Teresa helped everyone remove the chip from their necks. At that moment, she accidentally discovered that Brenda had been bitten by a crank, but was still unharmed. After asking, she found out that Brenda had only received one dose of the serum a few months ago, when they were still at the Ryams base, and Dr. Mary had taken the serum from Thomas's body. Teresa initially doubted the existence of the antidote, but suddenly she felt a sense of hope. She suggested to Thomas that they could run an experiment with the experiment group, but he no longer trusted her, so he remained unmoved. Teresa didn't say anything more, but calmly took the blood-soaked bandage from Thomas. Due to the strict security of the experiment group's building, each floor had guards, so Newt and Gally disguised themselves as special forces officers to escort Teresa inside. After successfully passing through the security gate with scanners, they cautiously made their way up the stairs, guided by Teresa, to destroy the cables and coordinate their intrusion into the experiment group's network system. Before long, they found the holding cells, and the immune teens who had been imprisoned were rescued. However, unfortunately, Minho was not among them. Teresa, through the system, discovered that Minho had been moved to the medical department on the other side of the building, so the three of them decided to split into two groups. Gally would take care of the immune people and stay behind to look for the serum. Meanwhile, Thomas, Newt, and Teresa would search for Minho. But halfway there, they encountered Jansen in the elevator. At this point, Thomas and Newt had disguised themselves as WCKD soldiers. Jansen didn't recognize them, while Teresa was so nervous that she kept swallowing. Just as they stepped out of the elevator and thought they were safe, Jansen became suspicious of something being off and walked over with a gun. In a desperate situation, Teresa locked Thomas and Newt inside a glass door, covering them so they could escape to the upper floors. Meanwhile, Minho wasn't idle at all. Even in his worst condition, he still managed to take down a doctor. Soon after, Newt and Thomas arrived, and the three friends were reunited. But just then, they were cornered by the guards' gunfire into a room. With Jansen cutting through the door, the three of them decided to jump into the swimming pool on the lower floor. Simple but effective, though they didn't celebrate too soon, because they had already caught the attention of 4 guards earlier. Just as the three thought they wouldn't escape death, one of the guards turned and shot the three other guards. But in fact, they were three enemies. This guard was Gally. It turned out that after Gally had delivered the immune people and the serum to Brenda, he had returned to the scene to provide backup. And at that moment, Brenda had become the wildest bus driver. Brenda was forced to flee with the immune kids to avoid being caught. Although they escaped pursuit, the city gate was heavily guarded, and it seemed nearly impossible to break through. Luckily, Brenda had a backup plan. The Freevent bus driver was officially in action. With Brenda's help, he moved the entire bus. After making a wide turn, the bus landed smoothly outside the high wall. The people on the bus were unharmed. Meanwhile, Lauren gathered the rebels outside the city to encourage them to conquer the last city. Lauren launched a desperate attack, blowing a hole in the city's wall. At this moment, the experiment group had been hit by a cyber attack, losing the ability to mobilize their defensive artillery. The rebel forces beneath the city seized this opportunity to launch their final strike, charging straight into the laboratory's headquarters. The last city suddenly sank into a sea of fire from the war. However, Thomas and the others were trapped in the middle and had to hide. At that moment, Newt's condition suddenly worsened. His lips turned dark and his body began to convulse uncontrollably. He gave his necklace to Thomas and said his final goodbyes. Thomas didn't want to leave his teammate behind. He urgently asked Minho and Gally to go find Brenda to get the serum, but shortly after, Newt passed out. Then, Teresa's voice came over the radio. She told Thomas that if he returned to the laboratory, he could save Newt. It turned out that Teresa had tested Thomas's blood on the bandage. In a moment of clarity, it was revealed to Thomas that the toxin within his body not only slowed the virus's progression, but could also turn against it. This meant that Thomas's serum might hold the key to curing the infection. He realized that he bore a monumental responsibility. He could potentially save humanity. Yet, before he could fully grasp the weight of this revelation, Newt began to lose his grip on sanity due to the virus. In a frantic state, Newt wanted to attack Thomas, oscillating between moments of clarity and madness. He pleaded with Thomas to free him from his torment, but the clarity was fleeting. He pinned Thomas down again, then regained his senses. Newt grabbed the gun and tried to end his life, but Thomas quickly stopped him. Newt couldn't live, but he couldn't die either. He spiraled back into madness, grabbing a knife and plunging it into Thomas's chest. Overwhelmed by the pain of seeing his friend hurt, Thomas felt helpless, wanting only to endure until Brenda could retrieve the serum. In a final act of desperation, Newt used the last vestiges of his reason to stab himself in the heart, because he had no other choice. Losing another close friend, Thomas endured unbearable pain. He returned to the experiment to find Ava and ask her if it was truly possible for him to save humanity. If the serum from just him worked, could the other immune people be spared? When Ava confirmed that it could, he felt a glimmer of hope and dropped his gun, believing that there was a way forward. But just then, Jansen appeared, shooting Ava without hesitation. In the chaos that ensued, Jansen subdued Thomas and took him back to the laboratory, revealing his true intentions. He wanted to monopolize the antidote. Only those who conquered the trials would gain access to such a precious resource. Jansen aspired to fulfill his unachieved ambitions, seeking to dominate the world. But first, he needed to ensure his own survival. However, unbeknownst to Thomas, Jansen had also been infected. After obtaining Thomas's blood, he demanded Teresa create the antidote. She was able to produce a vial, but just as Jansen prepared to inject himself, Teresa launched a surprise attack from behind. Teresa had longed for a way to heal humanity, but Jansen's ruthless methods were intolerable to her. In the midst of the struggle, she freed Thomas from his restraints, and together they made a break for it. As they fled, Jansen shot Thomas in the abdomen, causing him to stumble. They managed to hide in a crank research lab, but Jansen was relentless in his pursuit. When Teresa was discovered, she willingly surrendered the remaining antidote to Jansen in a desperate bid to save Thomas. She pleaded for him to spare Thomas, but Jansen's cold demeanor indicated he had no intention of showing mercy. Jansen threatened Thomas with Teresa's life. Thomas struggled to rise and grab an object to hit Jansen, but it only to miss. Jansen smirked, declaring Thomas had run out of chances. However, fate intervened dramatically when the glass in the cell shattered, and two cranks lunged at Jansen, biting him to death. In the aftermath, Teresa fled to the top floor of the building, dragging the injured Thomas with her. There, she entrusted him with the last vial of the antidote. Meanwhile, Horge and the others were flying overhead in a plane, spotting the two, but unable to get close due to the raging fire below. After several tense moments, Teresa managed to get Thomas onto the plane, but she chose to stay behind as the headquarters collapsed around her, consumed by flames. When Thomas finally regained consciousness, he found himself on an island. It looked primitive, but they were no longer disturbed by the virus. If not for the gunshot wound, Thomas would have felt like he was still dreaming. Finally, they had reached the paradise they had always dreamed of, and they would soon build a new home there. The friends who had sacrificed for this would also have their names engraved on stones so that everyone would remember them forever. This is the end of the movie. Thank you for watching the video. Goodbye and see you again.